To już teraz oficjalnie dzień dobry. Raz jeszcze witam serdecznie.
Now, let me welcome you this time officially in the Arkady Kubickiego in Warsaw. Welcome all the participants present here in person and online. This is the third and the last day of our Congress. We have two panels and the award ceremony of the Lech Kaczyński award. Please stay with us until the end of our shared day. Our strategic partners are
KGHM Polska Miedź, Fundacja KGHM Polska Miedź. Partnerzy główni Fundacja ARP, Fundacja Banku Polskiego SA, ARP, BGK, Fundacja BGK, Totalizator Sportowy, firmy Orlen i Fundacja Orlen. Partnerzy New Direction, Fundacja PGE, LOTOS, PGNiG, Narodowy Instytut Wolności, Centrum Rozwoju Społeczeństwa Obywatelskiego, a także Zamek Królewski w Warszawie, w którym gościmy. Partnerzy medialni, dzięki którym widzowie...
and our media partners, to whose support you can listen and read the proceedings.
Polskie Radio 24, Telewizja Polsat, Audytorium 17, to rozgłośnie regionalne Polskiego Radia, tygodniki Do Rzeczy i w sieci, Grupa Medialna Polska Press, a także wszystko, co najważniejsze. Dzisiejszy dzień zaczynamy od...
Today we are going to begin by the panel Eternal Europe. The moderator is well known to you, David Engels, who is an analyst, a historian, a philosopher, an essayist. I give the floor to you, Doctor, and members of the panel. Professor Heinz Theisen, who is a politologist, sociologist, and a constitutional lawyer. Tory Baucum, who is head of Center for Penn Life Benedictine College. Welcome.
Dr. Grzegorz Lewicki,
Dr. Grzegorz Lewicki, an analyst of international relations and civilizational processes, as well as technological processes. Léon Krier, he's an architect, an urbanist, new classical architecture. We are all ears, and I give the floor to you.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the invitation. It is a great pleasure and honor for me to chair the panel dedicated to our common homeland, the eternal Europe. And thus at the same time also to provide a little insight into the thoughts behind the book Europa Aeterna, which I had the privilege of publishing a few weeks ago, thanks to the support of the European conservatives and reformists, and three of whose authors are also on this panel. As a Belgian who grew up speaking German and French and who currently lives here in beautiful Warsaw, I think I can say that any purely national self-identification is wholly alien to me. My only love and loyalty is to that one and unmistakable Western civilization, which I find everywhere in the history, culture and identity of cities as diverse as Madrid, Dijon, Antwerp, Aachen, Prague, Vienna or Warsaw, and which I feel as my real homeland. A feeling of European patriotism for which I once coined the term Hesperialism. But this homeland is under threat. Rarely has the urgency of a solidary and powerful European collaboration become as clear as in recent months. Even before the outbreak of the Ukraine war, the Euro crisis, the migration crisis, the COVID crisis had all shown that only a close cooperation between the European peoples can make it possible to master the challenges of the present. Now, however, since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, this need has become a supreme urgency. In this respect, it is theoretically very welcome that national governments, the European Parliament and the European Commission seem all to be trying to develop various plans to bring about such a closer and more efficient union in practice. But Europe is divided. For the great differences in the proposed reform options reveal that two different camps have crystallized in recent years, namely that of the EU federalists, which seems to prevail politically above all in the west of Europe, and that of the EU sceptics, as we find it above all in the east of the Union. Both camps argue from very different points of view, and in doing so they put forward some perfectly justified arguments, as one must objectively concede. Yes, Europe needs close cooperation in certain key areas if it is to prevail against such dangerous challenges such as the Russian invasion, population decline, Chinese competition, deindustrialization, debt crisis, African mass migration, the aging of society, social polarization, increasing technological backwardness, or the education crisis. For the return to almost 40 small nation states, most of which do not even correspond to the size of a small Chinese town, cannot be a lasting solution, as otherwise our continent would become a patchwork of quarreling small states, which would quickly be degraded to pawns of the new great powers in the West, the East, and the South. But yes, the EU sceptics have very good arguments too on their side. And it should be noted that the word EU sceptic does not at all mean Eurosceptic. Indeed, it is totally unacceptable that century-old nation-states, which for most citizens still represent the ultimate reference points of democratic and cultural identity, are overplayed in favor of artificially created and often only very indirectly legitimized supranational structures, and that the decisions taken in Brussels or Strasbourg increasingly interfere in even the most intimate areas of daily life for which they were never granted any form of competence. This is all the more true as a certain leftist liberal consensus has emerged in recent years, not only in the EU Parliament, but also in the Western European media and national politics, which is anything but consensual in the east of the European Union, and which has led to a dangerous political climate where everything to the right of the left stands accused of dangerous right-wing extremism, an evolution which threatens to deprive Europe of one of its two lungs. So how do we solve this dilemma? Together with many intellectuals from all over Europe, I've tried to answer the question in two books called Renovatio Europae and also the Europa Eterna, as well as also in the preamble to a constitution for a confederation of European nation states, in which we sketched a Europe that takes into honest account the hopes and objections of both parties. Central to this are two ideas. On the one hand, we should strive once again to separate the important from the unimportant and to consider the ideal of subsidiarity when it comes to the competences and institutional design of the European Union, taking as a model those great supranational states that have shaped our European history over many centuries, such as the Sacrum Imperium, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, or the Habsburg dual monarchy. Only by concentrating the competences of the European Union on those few fields where there is indeed an urgent need for action and where supranational delegation can create political added value, will it be possible to make the citizens understand the need of the European Union and to clearly illustrate the separation from purely national competences. Such European competences could include the protection of external borders, a common foreign policy approach, pan-European mobility infrastructures, research, the fight against crime, or the adaptation of consumer standards. On the other hand, it seems necessary to strengthen the solidarity of European citizens too. The approach of the initial European communities had long been to take for granted a general understanding of our shared cultural heritage, and thus only focused on those abstract and universal human values that have been so horribly maltreated by totalitarianism. But unfortunately, since this time, this common cultural understanding has evaporated, as the implicit awareness among many Europeans that, for example, a Spaniard has more in common culturally with a Pole than, say, with a Moroccan, and a Greek more in common with a German than with a Turk, has increasingly dwindled. And with this awareness, the idea of a Western community of destiny, so common until well into the 20th century, has faded. What remains are only those universal values that are now also shared by the Japanese, the Koreans, the Lebanese, or the Argentines, so that the mere reference to our common values has ceased to inspire the Europeans with an exclusive sense of identity, of belonging, and of solidarity, resulting in growing national resentments, even more so as these values are more and more interpreted in a fundamentally dangerous way, where humanism is equated with globalism, ultraliberalism, LGBTQ ideology, multiculturalism, anti-Christianism, hedonism, and even transhumanism. Only if we re-emphasize those values that make Europe not only a civilization that protects universal rights, but also a specific culture with its own distinctive approach to the good, the beautiful, and the truth, to God, the world, and to human beings, will it be possible to re-establish that solidarity that now already applies within individual nations, but is missing on a European level, as the current European elites, when they speak of Europe, actually mean the world. We must once again, without arrogance, but with a healthy love of our own identity, bring our European spiritual, intellectual, and cultural heritage to the fore and offer the people of this continent a firmly defined, truly Hesperialist homeland that is greater than the nation state, but which does not stretch its credibility in an arrogant claim to pan-human representativeness. In this respect, it must be a matter of urgency for us, especially today, to reassure ourselves of this shared heritage and to ask ourselves not only how it could come about that more and more people even doubt the existence of our common identity, but also how we can succeed in making this identity implicitly or explicitly shared by all Europeans conscious again and cultivated. The guests on today's panel are virtually predestined to answer these questions, and I would like to take the liberty of asking them one after the other for their respective opinions in the area of their current sphere of activity. As the first guest, I welcome Father Baucum. Tory Baucum received a PhD in divinity and in intercultural theology and was rector of All Saints Church in Kansas City, Missouri, and in 2007 of Truro Church in Fairfax, Virginia. After founding the Truro Institute for Peace and Reconciliation, he began his conversion into the Catholic Church in 2018 and later renounced his Anglican ministry. Tory Baucum has written 2 books, Constructing Faith Cultures in 2005 and Evangelical Hospitality in 2018. Dear Father, our European civilization, as all civilizations, is based on the cult of what is good, what is beautiful, what is true. How would you define our specific Western approach towards this truth? And the second question would be, what happens to a society when it forgets about this notion and when it just dissolves itself into relativism and materialism?
I'm glad you're starting with, okay. Yeah, David, thank you for giving me the easy questions first. Let me back up a bit before I jump into that question. So I'm not a scholar of Poland, just a lover of Poland. My wife said she permitted me to have one mistress, and it was Poland. So I'm living that out. To me, Europe is not just a place, it's a heritage. And even if you're a Midwestern American, such as I am, the European heritage is primal, it's fundamental. Even when you're reacting against it, it's the thing that you're reacting against. And I'll give you an example. I serve and live in a Benedictine community in a small town in northeastern Kansas. The name of the town is Atchison. It's one of the poorest communities in the Midwest. Benedictine Abbey was started in 1856. German Benedictines left Germany because of Napoleon, and they settled in the territory of Kansas. They started the town, they started the community before Kansas was a state. If you know anything about American history, this was just at the cusp of the Civil War, and Kansas was known as Bleeding Kansas because it was a contested territory, whether it be free or slave. The Benedictines went there as missionaries. They not only didn't bring the faith, they brought a culture, a European culture, and it is the foundation of that community. So Europe is not just a place, it's a heritage that shaped all of us. When I was driving in here from the airport, Philippe asked me, when I come to Poland, do I prefer to compare it to the United States or contrast it? And I said, clearly compare, because I think Poland has much to teach the United States, I'm sure, but also Europe. A couple of things that I think are important. One is its experiment in multicultural democracy during the Commonwealth is still a rich resource for those who are committed to the ideals of democracy. It was a pioneer in religious freedom, which was unusual in that time. This was during the Reformation. A lot of Anabaptists came to Poland. They were brethren, Polish brethren. It was a concentrated settlement of Polish brethren here. Just to remind you, the Anabaptists, the only thing that Catholics and Protestants could agree about was killing Anabaptists. So, but they were safe here. A lot of Jews immigrated from the Iberian Peninsula, so you had this largest concentration of Jews in Poland. That happened in that period of time, and I think it's a very rich example. It wasn't perfect, but no state is. So I would say one of the things that I look for, to answer your question now about truth and beauty, is the freedom of the human person to worship God, first and foremost. That's what I do for a living, but I believe it's the first freedom. It's the freedom that's foundational to all the other freedoms. I think Poland has pioneered that freedom as well or better than just about anybody. So that's one of the things that I look to. It's one of the things that I'm committed to. The other thing that I'm committed to in this conversation about Poland and Europe is that Poland is an old country, but it's a new nation. Unlike America, which is an old nation, but a new country. So by the time you dissolved as a state, we started as a state. And you were without a state for over 200 years, which is pretty extraordinary. Israel was without a state for 2,000 years, but you were without a state for 200 years. But we don't have an old country, so we don't have customs and traditions except for what we've inherited and which we've consciously nurtured. It's kind of like we're like a group of people that have had 1,000 years of prefrontal cortex sheared off and left with limbic brains. And that's essentially what's going on in America in our political system. But you have this deep memory that you can draw upon. I've been hearing all these allusions to different episodes and parts of the Polish history that you're drawing upon to navigate this particular moment in European history. And that's different. That's different than what we have in the United States. It's a very rich resource, and that's one of the reasons I'm very much committed to telling this story to the United States. If I might just push on one point here, I think you need to do a better job of telling your story to the larger West, especially America. We don't understand it. We don't have a context. I think you're leading the world right now in your hospitality to Ukrainian refugees, in your navigating the political difficulties. So these are all the reasons I come. This is what I think Europe has to offer, especially the Polish experience of Europe. And what you've given us in terms of religious freedom, I think, is the foundation of all freedoms. It's also the foundation to be able to pursue truth and to pursue beauty, which for me are pretty much the same thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that intervention, to which I wholeheartedly agree also. Absolutely. Thank you. As a second guest, I would welcome my friend Léon Krier. Krier, who is nearly a compatriot of mine, as he's from Luxembourg. I'm from Belgium, so we are within the same Benelux field of culture. Léon Krier, born in Luxembourg City, is a consultant in architecture, urbanism, and design. He propagates the technological, ecological, and social rationality and modernity of traditional urbanism and architecture, summarized in his book, The Architecture of Community of 2009. Krier is considered the founder of the new urbanism movement. Since 1988, he developed the general plans for the new town of Poundbury for the Prince of Wales. Since 2003, for the Cayala project in Guatemala, and since 2018 of Herencia de Allende, a new town in Mexico. Krier is also visiting professor at the Yale School of Architecture, winner of the first Richard Dryhouse Architecture Prize in 2003, and commander of the Royal Victorian Order. Dear Léon, beauty is obviously also one of the pillars of our European identity. Without beauty, the whole project of a common culture just dissolves into mere welfare and mere materialism. So I would ask you, how would you define this specifically Western approach towards beauty? What is the essence somehow of our concept of beauty? And again, what is happening to a society that forgets about beauty, where the sense of beauty is dissolving, that is producing essentially extremely ugly cultural artifacts and forces people to live within them? What does it do to the human soul? So, very general question, but I'm sure you are the man to respond to that.
René Girard said that Satan is not the god of darkness, but Satan is the name of a structure which is decomposing or self-destructing. I think beauty is not something which is special to Europe, but it's a condition of nature, that the creation which we don't understand the first thing about, but what we get, what our five senses understand in a flash, is what is beautiful and what is ugly, what is pleasant and what is unpleasant. And when beauty is missing, we suffer. Now we are so used to lack of beauty, not only in most people's work, in most people's houses, in most people's educational facilities, cultural facilities. We live in a kind of pornography of decay and loss of values. And we are not even aware of it. And I don't agree at all about what is so powerfully vented here, that we are the good against the evil Russians. No, I think that's too simple. You should read René Girard to understand what's going on, and Clausewitz. What I got from my own home, my father was a craftsman, a marchand tailleur, maître tailleur. He vested the Bishop of Luxembourg and the Luxembourg clergy. And my mother was a pianist. She played Chopin like I still try today. So I had beautiful brothers and sisters. We were a house of beautiful habits. My father employed people. They were friends. We as children played in the workshop of my father. And I grew up, and all this happened overlooking a beautiful city of Luxembourg, which was a perfect city when I grew up as a child. There were some suburbs, a bit of industrial borders, but the ugly stuff which made Luxembourg rich was 20 kilometers south of the town. And at night, the sky would light red, orange, like now sodium color. We never went there. So I lived while modernism was developing powerfully under enormous investment, capital investment of the Marshall Funds, my father said, you children can't become craftsmen because the state, the Luxembourg state, the European states are in bed with criminal capital and they are going to destroy us. You can't be craftsmen because we are finished. My father only made money when he had no longer employees and he worked with one assistant for the last 3 years before he retired. But during that time, Luxembourg had been destroyed, the north of Luxembourg had been destroyed by the Rundstedt offensive and the American response to it. And we as children lived the reconstruction of the most beautiful, now the only beautiful places left in Luxembourg is Echternach, a famous abbey, which was, the Codex of Echternach is world famous, and had been destroyed in 1945, but entirely rebuilt during our childhood. So what happened in Echternach, or partially in Luxembourg villages, was parallel to what happened here in the Stare Miasto. And you have not to forget that this was the reconstruction of the Stare Miasto was the work of 3-4 people. Without those 3-4 people, it would have been destroyed. It would have been left destroyed. And it was recorded. It was rebuilt on drawings which had been done by a professor and his students in 1937-38. So it really, what this world, which is being torpedoed and destructed and going to hell, depends now on very few individuals. And one of them is the Prince of Wales. I worked for the Prince of Wales, and we built a town which is now beautiful. It works well. Most people who live there work in town, and we do everything which was said is not possible to do nowadays. You can't do it philosophically, you can't do it economically, you can't do it technically, you can't do it. You don't have the craftsmen, you don't have the traffic, you don't understand the traffic. We have done it and it works and people love it, they buy into it. It's extremely successful and the Prince of Wales makes even a lot of money with it, even though we have been imposed to have 25% of social housing. But that is not grouped in zones, but it's higgledy-piggledy distributed around town. So there are solutions. Unfortunately, the states, the modern European states, are under guidance of people who are irresponsible. Look at all the European buildings built in Brussels, in Luxembourg or Strasbourg, the parliaments, are just rot architectural abstractions. They have nothing to do with architecture, they have nothing to do with Europe. Now what we see that beauty is common, is something which allies humankind, and ugliness divides it. Languages divide humankind, religions divide humankind, empires divide humankind, but beauty unifies mankind. We as Catholics, lapsed or not, we can go to Isfahan and admire mosques or architecture of totally different culture and beliefs, but we see it as a reflection of beauty. It's beauty which is a reflection of an order, of a living organism, which fulfills us every day. Now, one of the main problems of our civilization, industrial, now the fourth industrial civilization, which is destroying the world, is that most people earn their living and the living of their families with terrible jobs, with idiotic work. David Graeber, who was a professor he just died, at London School of Economics, has published a book 2 years ago, just before dying, called Bullshit Jobs. He analyzed what do people do in these countries. And most people, 99% what people do, how they earn their money, can be replaced tomorrow by an automaton, by a robot. So what is that? Whereas when you have an artisan culture, you can't replace it tomorrow by a robot. Because every object this artisan does is unique, reflects the same order than the divine creation, or whatever we call it. Because they are unique, they have a unique identity, even though they have similarity to other types of beings, of objects, And what is very interesting about architecture and town planning is that particularly traditional town planning and architecture compared to modernist town planning is that it creates something which we call now common good without knowing what it means. We think it's just social justice. No. Common good is that space between buildings, which like here in the Stare Miasto, you walk in those spaces, in those squares, you look at those buildings, the modest buildings, the monumental buildings, the grand and the low and the high buildings, and they are language which you, without being informed about architecture, you understand without explanation, without justification, without schooling, because we have it in our habits, in our deepest habits, that we love things which reflect an order. But the order of architecture and town planning is an artificial order, it's not natural. We imitate nature by analogy. And that is what is so, Hannah Arendt says that, what makes the world, the built world, the traditional built world so familiar is its artificiality, it's uniquely human and cannot be replaced by rock formations or by natural forms which have nothing to do with. Because they are alien to us. We are not natural beings. We are products of our beliefs, of our education. And so I think it's very important that we begin to speak that architecture is not a natural product of a civilization automatic. Now the Ministry of Planning, the Ministry of Culture, the ministries have to do with art. They have nothing to do. They don't build Europe. They destroy Europe. And that is why I was so pleased to hear yesterday Mr. Carbo who talked about because with David we want to launch my last project will be a small capital for Europe, the idea, so that Europe can be a small capital with symbolic institutions, not with technocratic, monstrous ministries who are going to dictate you how to light your backyard, how to drive your car, and what to do, in your intimacy. That is to safeguard that public space, which is the space for democracy. Without that space, democracy is dying, and it's already dead, mostly. In Germany, it's already dead, even though they have these beautiful old towns which survive or which have been reconstructed. Now, so that is, there is a choice in architecture. It's not fate. And the choice is to go back to a human scale in architecture, in town planning, into beauty which is self-evidently accepted by people without explaining. I see people everywhere photographing here. You go to an industrial, a horrible kind of Soviet-type Panelaki residence, nobody is photographing those buildings. No. The only decent building done here by the Soviets was the Tower of Culture, and it's a damn good building. It's a beautiful building, and people love it. You are not allowed to say it because it's Russian now. No. And the Russians are the devils. We should not think in these simple categories. The Russians are human, God damn it. They're even Christians. So I think, no, we have enough to speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Léon. So architecture and beauty is a choice, not a fate. So that is very well said, I think, and we would all, I think, really win from thinking about that and reminding about that, and hopefully also reminding our politicians that this ugliness is not a fate, but that we can also have the choice to do and to build beautiful things. So thank you very much. As a third guest, I would like to welcome my colleague Heinz Theisen. Heinz Theisen was professor for political science at the Catholic University of Applied Sciences of North Rhine-Westphalia in Cologne, and now works essentially as a freelance author and speaker. His main focus is on Europe, the Middle East, conflicts, cultures, modern world order, and so forth. In spring 2022, by the way, he published just some weeks ago his newest book with the title Selbstbehauptung, warum sich Europa und der Westen begrenzen müssen, so self-assertion, why Europe and the West must limit themselves. So very interesting use of the word begrenzen, limitation and self-limitation. And so, of course, as a specialist in political sciences, I would like to ask you what you would define as the typically Western or European sense of civic identity. What makes us specific, or what makes the sense of civic identity that arose in Europe in these last 100 years and that is now sadly declining in the West? What makes this typically European? On the one hand, can we put our finger on what it really means to be a citoyen, a Bürger in Europe? And of course, as a follow-up question to that, what happens when people forget about their civic identities? What happens if they become atomized, collectivist beings that do not care anymore about the different degrees of solidary communities, of society, and just basically fend for themselves while being at the same time submitted to these enormous bureaucratic machineries that are establishing themselves not only in the nation states, but unfortunately also in the European Union?
First, let me thank you for the invitation. In Germany, it's hardly possible to talk about these issues, about culture, identity, and so on. We have now a deconstructed culture of self-denial. It's not only in Germany this way, but in big parts of Europe, self-denial. And this is astonishing because the self-denial of one's own is an evolutionarily improbable process. For in the evolution history of mankind, every living being, every group of people, every state has to struggle for self-assertion. How long can Europe afford not to do this? It is easy to see that such an attitude can only flourish in a state of extreme security, as in the West, in an alienation from reality. Decadence means not wanting to fight anymore. However, the war in Ukraine changes this noticeably. We need another conscience of self-assertion. And let me mention the civility as a solution for it. Europeans can no longer afford to ignore the laws of evolution, to sacrifice the protection of their own to idealized slogans. The citizen of the world is a contradiction in terms. The glocal citizen, glocal, demanded today, however, would be a patriot, European and Atlanticist at the same time, a Westerner. Instead of focusing only on what is far away, he would once again devote himself to what is near and to the balance between it, and to the balance between social, economic, and ecological sustainability. In civility, the balance is decisive. Maybe we can define civility as balancing the contradictions of life. Civility is beyond left and right because from its core it always demands the balancing of opposites, of ora et labora, of ideal and material interests, of mutual complementing of work and leisure, of rights and duties, of self-interests and common interests, of present and future concerns, of promoting and demanding. This attitude enabled the rise of industrial society, social market economy, and constitutional democracy. And it could also enable a renewed self-assertion of Europe and the West. So our journey around the world always ends with ourselves, with the citizen. We may hope that the creative destruction will not only apply to ever new economic processes, as Schumpeter said, but also to cultural processes. For everything that does not limit itself, like the deconstructivism of our days, will inevitably destroy itself. This is what we are currently facing on many levels. We can make preparations for the time after that. And in this time, self-assertion will be a new paradigm. in a society that at least still wants to hold on to its freedom, order, on the other hand, it's not an aim in itself, as it is in the authoritarian systems, but serves to assert a free order. The self-assertion paradigm would help fault both the old left-right division and the new division along national, European and Western levels of actions. It would refer to the positive heritage of the nation state, especially the constitutional and social state, and its liberal democratic structures. To the European culture of freedom, individual rights, and other foundations of a liberal and solidary order laid by Christianity, natural law, and the Enlightenment. To the role to be jointly preserved by the Western world vis-à-vis authoritarian and totalitarian world powers. So I believe from the paradigm of self-assertion, it follows for all levels of actors that it is only a matter of a defensive attitude, which is underlined by its own self-definition. This is the most important limitation, the self-definition of Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this comprehensive overview over this notion of civility and of self-assertion, which I found really interesting and enlightening. Last but not least, as a fourth guest, I would like to welcome Grzegorz Lewicki. Grzegorz is consultant on forecasting in international relations for the private and public sectors. He graduated from the London School of Economics and from Maastricht University, among others, and is a member of the International Society for the Comparative Study of Civilizations. His research includes the development of civilizations and of new technology. He is the author of the book Nadchodzi Novi Proletariat on civilization according to Arnold Toynbee. Dear Greg, so we heard a lot about civility, about self-assertion, about beauty, of course, about God. There is a notion that also started to creep up, that is that our social life should not just be reduced to what is called, let's say, social justice in the sense of social justice warriors. But nevertheless, of course, if we want to build a society that can be stable, that can be durable as it was in the past, we need to define also how our ideal image of how such a society can assure some form of justice, some form of harmony, some form of proportion that on the one hand, of course, respects the individual, but on the other hand also puts into focus also the society as a whole, because we see today, of course, with the enormous ever-growing social polarization, that a purely ultra-liberal approach towards society leads sooner or later to the explosion of society, even to civil wars. So this is a difficult equilibrium to find between individualism on the one hand, but social responsibility on the other hand. So my question would be, is there, and we see, of course, that in different civilizations, like in Islam, like in China, like in India, there are very different approaches to this generally human question that are developed. So how could we somehow define or grasp what is typically a Western view on social justice, social harmony, and so forth? And of course, how is that linked to the sad world of today, where this notion seems to be disappearing more and more?
Yes, that's a very, very difficult question. Also because, as my predecessor said, you know, speaking about cultures, about culture as in my case, as a variable in prognostics, in foresight, well, it's kind of, you know, a very tricky thing, because many countries in Western Europe actually decreed, well, an unimportance of culture as a let's say, security-related variable. Whereas when we look at the collective identities, let us imagine we gradually, hover up as like a drone, achieving a bird's eye view. So first we have a family, and that it's basically a cell of identity. Then you have neighborhood, region, then you have a nation, then you have civilization, right? And it is extremely important that we speak of civilizational identities which are related to cultural and national identities. Why? I hear that in quite a few capitals in Europe these days, diplomats are discouraged from using the term the West anymore. Basically because, well, it's not profitable anymore, it's too Euro-Atlantic, too USA-centric, and so on. Whereas if we would reject the West as an identity, then of course we could build our identity solely of this European identity, but we would really start to crumble. There's this very stinky term called social cohesion these days. It's being hijacked by the hard right in Europe. It's being, well, questioned, rejected, and spit on by the left in Europe. Whereas when you look at the heritage of all major civilization in the world, this term is, well, running. This term is operating in the background. Let us take, for example, the medieval thinker Ibn Khaldun. He coined this, he was using this term asabiya. Asabiya was this term to denote the social unity. So we together as a society have this social unity that aims at realizing some overarching general, very general goal. If we, get rid of this from the European system, then we are basically done. And I'm quite, well, as a Pole, I'm quite kind of frankly astonished why speaking about cultural differences is such a problem. After all, if you take research of such organizations like, for example, World Values Survey, if you take the research by modern intercultural psychology, you have this idea of cultural distance between the cultures. It can be measured, basically, by different variables. And it shows how different cultures differ, what they have in common, what potential tensions and what potential synergies these differences can generate. So civilizational identity in principle, I'm developing this concept right now together with some econometric measurements. Civilizational identity is a network of identity. In my work, which is prognosticism, foresight for the military, for public, for private sector, this is a very important variable. Me and my colleagues, we have literally predicted what would be happening in Ukraine right now. A year ago, I wrote an essay that was basically predicting what is happening. In the past, when I was giving a lecture, for example, for Germans, the French, even for the Ukrainians, after this first invasion of Russia onto Ukraine, well, I was told, and I told them, the demarcation line, the fight will take somewhere in the Dnieper River, because this is how these cultural radiations from Russia and from Europe interact. Well, some of them said, well, culture is unimportant. You don't have a right to say that. It won't happen at all. Some of them told me, why is that? So basically, I was cancelled for saying this cultural variable is important. As a foresight consultant, I really got used that people really don't like the things I say. People frequently, mistake normative prognostics for descriptive prognostics. So normative prognostic is how I would like the future to look like, no matter the data, the empirical input. Whereas descriptive prognostic is all about what might happen, what is at risk, what might transpire, no matter my personal ideas and so on. So I had the same problem when I'm speaking, for example, about the idea of new Middle Ages. That is to say, I'm writing about this in the book. Shall I finish, or shall I have some? Okay. There's a bundle of 7 interconnected mega trends that are really working in the background, that will really change our civilization in Europe. One of these trends is the ongoing fragmentation on the national level and kind of concentration of power on the international level. The other is the Great Migration, really comparable. It's really comparable to the Völkerwanderung that took place in late antiquity, that then later on gave floor to the Middle Ages. Then the third factor is the growing importance of ethnicity and religion on the public life. We could say, of course, but people are rejecting religion and so on. Yes, but if you apply to this dynamic such tools as game theory, network theory, then you could see the patterns of migration, the patterns of living choices by individuals. If they are taken on this kind of mass level, then you realize that what we are experiencing in Europe right now is something I call Balkanization. So kind of cultural fragmentation. People are networking, trying to live with the people that seem to be like them. This kind of creates patterns of fragmentation, alienation, even political separatism. But for example, if you take the European Foresight Report, the recent European Foresight Report, this is well omitted. There's a lot of very important things in there, like climate change, like crisis of democracy, like the military risk and so on. But you don't have the issue of social stability at all. Why? Of course, political correctness and so on and so on. But if the very fact that we would, tear or destroy the clock, it would not mean, the time stops flowing. So, just to finish this with this kind of positive note, when we look how Europe handled, Eastern and Central Europe handled the multiculturalism, I'm writing about this in the book, it seems, because, many people are asking, wow, how is it possible Poland, absorbs so many millions of Ukrainians? You were so, xenophobic, racist. This is what I heard when I was traveling to the Western Europe. And I said, no. Look, we do have the sprouts and the remnants of something that was called in the past Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It was, maybe not all of you are aware, but there was this great, tremendous, powerful social organism encompassing Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, parts of Ukraine, which created something that historians refer to as a country without stakes, which means in the area of, religious wars in Europe, we created this kind of stable area of tolerance that lasted centuries. And what I'm trying to do in my research is I'm trying to pinpoint the kind of regulative context and trying to take out the rules that made all of this possible. And these rules were first created, intentionally, but some of these rules emerge really intuitively. This is what is happening. Like all of my friends who are like hosting some Ukrainians, they say, because you have to. Because this is something that's, you have a free flat, you have a passive income from this flat, you just give it to the people. You don't think of when they would leave. You don't think of how this would unfold. It's very, very symbolical. That's why I think, as opposed to the multiculturalism in Western Europe, that really made some tremendous mistakes. I'm writing more about this in the book. But basically what happened in Western Europe after the Second World War is that from one radicalism that was, for example, Nazism, that basically rejected all plurality unconditionally. Then Western Europe especially switched to unconditional accepted of plurality, no matter the underlying variables. Both strategies are too radical. And if you apply a radical strategy that reduces cultural, social, political complexity to some simplification, like some kind of simplified objects, then of course reality will throw the result in your face, and this is what we are seeing right now. So it's not the fact that Poles suddenly changed and they absorbed so many Ukrainians. No, this was the underlying cultural tenet of our culture that was there in the past. And this also means a lot for the future, because we will be kind of reshaping or returning to these patterns of new political philosophy, new cultural approach, new multiculturalism. But this is what I'm really thankful to you, gentlemen, that you mentioned that we should really speak about this more. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Greg. I really like the metaphor that it is not by destroying the clock that simply time as a phenomenon is disappearing. And looking at the clock now, we just have a few minutes left, but I think it is perhaps worthwhile to just add a very quick second round of question where I would ask you perhaps just to limit yourself to a minute or two in response. It's rather a game somehow, because now we showed or we saw where many of the main problems of our Western identity today are lying. And of course, you all are also active in your fields of profession in trying to fight that, be it by building beautiful towns, be it by publishing and analyzing events, be it also by ministering actively and dealing with people, speaking about the faith and so forth. So individually, of course, all of you are trying to contribute your share, but obviously we are not politicians, so they do not have much power, of course. And so my follow-up question would be, and perhaps we just go the other way around, perhaps starting again with Greg, is now how can we, or if you were counselor to IT politician in a European country, if you had to give him one counsel or two about how to recreate some form of social cohesion, of asabiya to his own country, what would you advise him to do concretely as a political measure or as a concrete measure where we could go into the right direction? What would you advise in a minute or so?
There are some structural things you could do. One thing would be very difficult. It would be, I would call it a card of mutual rights and obligations of the Europeans. But as we know, the European Parliament had this problem with establishing some value-based European constitutions. The first, something that would be a workaround, a solution in terms of really practical political solution, would be strengthening, reforming the European Committee of Regions, which is quite local, and make it kind of more conducive to the regional, democratic wants, and basically this could enhance the dialogue. But of course, the idea you put forward in the book, namely, we would need this kind of new constitution, but that would not really refer to the general concept, but to the heritage. This should be really talked about. Why? Because in 10 or 20 years, there would be no space left for this kind of discussions, because we would be so divided in Europe that it would not be possible anymore. So, of course, other solutions would be possible to integrate Europe then, but this one would be lost. So I think it's the last, warning bell if we want to go in this direction.
Yeah, thank you. Strengthening the regions, and yeah, that seems to be a very good proposal, which was also initially one of the major aims of the European communities when they even invented this notion of region, which had somehow been forgotten after the French Revolution and this centralizing Jacobinite approach towards state power, returning to regional autonomy and regional identity as a means also of strengthening a certain diversity in Europe and imposing also subsidiarity on this level. So that seems indeed like a very good tactic. Heinz Theisen, what would you advise to a mighty politician in order to not impose, but at least ease some form of what you call self-assertion in the West?
I would advise him to resign. Most of our politicians are precarious academics, which are lucky to find a job. Yeah? We cannot we cannot have much hope in them. I would like to advise real working people that they have to build up civility from the bottom up. Forget about universities, medias, and parties and parliaments in Germany. You have to build up civility from the bottom up. You have to advise the people to do their own things. Don't trust in politicians, don't trust in the media, work for yourself, build up a new society. That's subsidiarity, that's regional, that's sustainability on all fields. We have to build up a new civility from the bottom up. I have no more hope in the academic sphere. It's mostly deconstructed. So look at ourselves, of our groups, of our civil society, which in rests are still existing in Europe. And we, I think, have to build them up.
Thank you very much. Yeah, there is indeed a problem with the political caste, and there is indeed this question to what degree they are even able and willing to see these issues, because they arrive very often in politics also already with a very warped and thwarted approach towards what they should finally defend and nurture, which leads over to the notion of beauty and to Léon Krier once again. And I think that in many of our political conservative conferences, we are not at all speaking enough about aesthetics, about beauty, about what makes life really livable from an aesthetic point of view, even often to the point that when I assist in let's say, semi-conservative conferences and events, well, already often the choice of music or of the background or of the place where we are is so counterproductive to what we really want to put forward that there is even some form of cognitive dissonance. I remember one of the Walenburg Society meetings that was taking place in Oxford in an ugly, brutalist building where somehow we thought about, well, why are we here? This is absolutely the opposite to what we want to realize. Of course, there is some form of negative inspiration, because if you develop that hate of your surrounding, perhaps the love for something that is beautiful is also growing. But still there is this cognitive dissonance somewhere where it seems that many conservatives are, when it comes to their own taste, already much more postmodern somehow than really relying on the eternal canon of beauty that is modeled on the proportions, of course, of the human body, at the same time also the heritage of our civilization. So, of course, I know that you, Léon Krier, you have already done more than your share in building entire towns with cathedrals and advising princes in the UK in order to teach by example, and all that is, of course, tremendously important. But still, we see it is not enough somehow. It is one tiny fight against the massive tide. And so what do you think? Is there any means that by advising a politician on some, let's say, more formal measures, it could be possible to turn the tide and to again instill some more decent, some more sound sense of aesthetic, at least in public building? Is there any means of formalizing such a fight? What would you think?
Well, cultures are basically to do with ideas. And the conviction now, which is general, that most people, most citizens have terrible work. They live in terrible conditions. Their children are being educated by totally irresponsible, experimentalist, Dadaist, kind of absurdists. Huh? And within this mess, which is extremely dangerous, I think we're going, I mean, rereading René Girard, he says we're in the antechamber of apocalypse because things are so violent and getting larger and larger. The scale is so inhuman, has nothing anymore to do with human scale, is to go back to human scale in most matters. Because there are things which need to be global, but most things we do have to do with local affairs. I mean, I'm born in Luxembourg. I'm the master planner of the first English traditional town, built in 60 years, 70 years. And it's as good as any historic town. We don't have churches. I always had the square in each, we have 4 quarters. In each quarter, there's a square for town hall and a market building and one for church. We still don't have a church because the English people don't go anymore to church. They say, we have already too many churches in the region. But anyway, the important thing is to go back to human scale also in economic matters. The only theoretician I know about human scale in economics is called Leopold Koch, very important Austrian economist, totally forgotten. But he's the only one who addressed this issue of human scale in economics. Because what we have now, the global scale in economics, is totally anti-human, anti-cultural, anti-pleasure, anti-beauty. It's just a horrendous development towards extreme violence, which is going to end up in atomic war, as we are now at the footsteps. But I think as all errors are based on wrong thinking, on stupid thinking, it's good to go back to Aristotle, politics. What he says is that economy should not be dictating what people do, but people, individual, God-created individuals, each one has different talent. Some play well the piano, some work wood, some do buildings, and only in building, you know, to do the Stare Miasto here, you had 39 different crafts, each one done by individuals who are extremely talented just for that craft. And a person who works iron doesn't like to work wood. A pianist necessarily does not want to play the violin. And so it's to go back to these basics. What do we do with our hands? Because the hands are direct linked to our brains, and that creates culture. Robots don't create culture, and transhumanism is the end of the world. And the people in Davos, they are criminals. The group of Davos, they are criminals. And the only horror I have is that Prince of Wales, who is a very important person, that he's now part of that group. I tried to get him out of there. But, you know, Klaus Schwab, he's a criminal. They are demented, they want to destroy this world. What we know as the world of human scale, of beauty, of people dancing in the streets, you know, doing nice things, and so on.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. You said something very important. You said that even in this magnificent new town, the church is still missing, and so that is, of course, the ideal apropos for the last word, I would say, in this discussion by Father Baucum. What can we do somehow to place again the church in the town, this missing place, to fill it again? How can we bring people back to at least to transcendence? What can we do apart from our individual example? Is there any concrete measure we could perhaps put forth to again instill that in people in a very short time, of course?
Yeah, the pragmatic question comes to the American. I'm hesitant. You know, it has been said that Russians are Manichaean, Americans are Pelagian, And I like to think Poles are romantic Augustinians. And this is a pragmatic kind of question, but I want to be a romantic Augustinian in my answer. And a corollary of religious freedom, something that the Poles have championed on and off for many centuries. The corollary, I think there's two for us. One is ecumenism and interfaith work. One of the reasons I came, I suggested to Mikhail, I will come, but only if you invite my friend Rabbi Mark Gopin, who will be on the next panel, who's an expert of understanding religiously motivated violence and what it does to people, what it does to communities, how do we heal them. I work with him at the George Mason Carter School of Conflict Resolution and Peace Building. So one of the corollaries, I think, is really taking seriously religious freedom, and that means taking seriously ecumenism. And Luigi Giussani said, ecumenism, interfaith work, always begins with the truth of the other. So that's one thing religious communities can model. And I think any work that we do in the future, Christians and Jews and Muslims should work together because we are three monotheistic faiths. I know there's a lot of debate about how we understand the nature of God, but we do believe there is one God, and he has the right to tell us what to do. That's what monotheism is. He has the right to tell us what to do. So that's one. The other corollary, in terms of working this out, is to understand that war itself is the dark side of religion many times. So this is a religious war that's going on in Ukraine. That Putin and Patriarch Kirill have a very deficient and heretical understanding of the Christian faith, and they're acting out of that. And one of the things that you have to do when you're looking at war and trying to understand the causes of it is you can't just be material. Nikolai Berdyaev, the great Russian existential philosopher, said that war was always an apocalypse from below, by which he meant that when you look at a war, you see all the material objects, tanks, soldiers, guns, bombs, and you're tempted to believe that it is a material reality that you're dealing with. But he said, actually deeper, it's a spiritual reality. Because what you have is a history of accumulated grievances, that is hurts, which become bitterness, which become hardness, which become hatred, and war is the permission and the opportunity to act on that. So he called it an apocalypse from below, and that's one of the things that's going on in a religiously motivated war, which is what we have in Ukraine. The other part of it is really an insight I got from the French Jewish Christian philosopher Simone Weil, who said that war was also an apocalypse from above. And in her essay on the Iliad, she said she thought it was a divinely inspired poem, epic, because God doesn't take sides.
Thank you.
God, no, I'm not done. God doesn't take sides. This is important. And that God is like, this is my my midrash. God is like the Jewish mother, or the Russian mother and the Ukrainian mother who just wants her son to come home. So war is also a revelation of what's going on from above, below and from above. And I think that's the kind of analysis that you need to bring to this situation. And I think a materialistic worldview does not give you that opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you very much for these words. So, yeah, this closes this panel. So once again, I would like to thank our speakers here for their brilliant insight into what eternal Europe means, what it was, what it is, what it might be. So once again, thank you very much for coming here. And I will give over the word to our moderator. So thank you very much all.
Ja również dziękuję panelistom. David Engels.
I also thank the panelists. Thank you, Mr. David Engels.
Drodzy Państwo, kolejny